I still remember the exact moment I realized the man I had trusted with my entire career, the man I had called my mentor, my second father, had been destroying me from the inside out. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October, and I was sitting in a conference room on the 32nd floor of the Callahan and Associates building in downtown Chicago, staring at a document that made my hands shake so violently I had to set it down on the polished mahogany table. The document was a termination letter, but that wasn't what broke me. What broke me was the reason listed, the lies typed so neatly in black ink, the signature at the bottom that belonged to a man who had looked me in the eye just 3 hours earlier and told me I was like a son to him. Richard Callahan. Rick, the man who had recruited me straight out of community college, who had paid for my night school MBA, who had stood as best man at my wedding and held my daughter the day she was born. The man who had just accused me of embezzling $400,000 from the company I had helped build from the ground up. And as I sat there in that cold conference room with security guards waiting outside to escort me from the building like a criminal, I made a promise to myself. I would find the truth. I would expose every lie, and I would make Richard Callahan understand exactly what it feels like to have everything you love ripped away by someone you trusted completely. But I should start at the beginning. I should tell you how a kid from the south side of Chicago ended up in a corner office overlooking Lake Michigan, and how the man who put me there became the same man who tried to destroy everything I had worked for. Because this story isn't just about revenge, it's about loyalty, and what happens when you give that loyalty to someone who sees it only as a weakness to exploit. I grew up in Englewood, which, if you know anything about Chicago, you know that's not exactly the kind of neighborhood that produces Fortune 500 executives. My father worked 3 jobs just to keep the lights on, and my mother cleaned houses for wealthy families on the North Shore. I was the first person in my family to graduate high school, and when I walked across that stage at 17 years old, my mother cried so hard she could barely take the photograph. College wasn't really an option, not with my father's medical bills piling up and my 2 younger sisters still in school, so I did what a lot of kids from my neighborhood did. I got a job. But unlike most of those kids, I got lucky. I got a job in the mailroom of a small financial consulting firm called Callahan and Associates. It was 2008, and the company had maybe 40 employees working out of a cramped office space on Wacker Drive. I was 22 years old, making $11 an hour, and I thought I had hit the lottery. The work was simple: sort the mail, deliver packages, make coffee runs, stay invisible. But I've never been good at staying invisible. I've always been the kind of person who notices things, who asks questions, who wants to understand how everything works, and I guess that's what caught Richard Callahan's attention. Rick, as everyone called him, was 40 years old back then, and already a legend in Chicago's financial circles. He had started his company with nothing but a Harvard MBA and a small loan from his father, which I later learned was actually $3 million. But that's a detail he conveniently left out of his origin story. By the time I started in the mailroom, Callahan and Associates had carved out a niche in corporate restructuring, helping struggling companies reorganize their finances to avoid bankruptcy. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was profitable, and Rick had a gift for making clients trust him with their most desperate situations. The first time Rick spoke to me directly was about 3 months into my employment. I had been sorting the morning mail when I noticed something strange. 2 envelopes from the same bank, addressed to 2 different people at the company, but the account numbers visible through the envelope windows were only 1 digit apart. I probably should have minded my own business, but something about it bothered me. So I did a little digging. I compared the envelopes to previous mail I had sorted. I noticed patterns, and I realized that someone was opening duplicate accounts in the company's name without authorization. I typed up a 1-page memo explaining what I had found, slipped it under Rick's office door, and waited. The next morning, Rick called me into his office. I remember thinking I was about to get fired. Instead, he looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, and asked me where I had gone to school. I told him the truth. Englewood High, class of 2004. No college. He nodded slowly, drummed his fingers on my memo, and said something I would remember for the rest of my life. He said, "Marcus, there are two kinds of people in this world. There are people who see problems, and there are people who see solutions. Most people in your position would have ignored those envelopes. You didn't. That tells me something about who you are." 3 days later, I was transferred out of the mailroom and into the accounts payable department. 6 months after that, Rick personally recommended me for the company's tuition reimbursement program and encouraged me to enroll in night classes for my bachelor's degree. Within 2 years, I had my degree and a promotion to junior analyst. Within 5 years, I had my MBA and a position as senior account manager. And within 8 years, I was vice president of client relations, the youngest VP in company history, and Richard Callahan's right-hand man. Those were good years. Great years, actually. I met my wife, Angela, at a company Christmas party in 2012. She was working as an assistant to one of our major clients, and when she laughed at something I said, I knew immediately that I was going to marry her. We got engaged 6 months later, married the following spring, and welcomed our daughter, Maya, into the world in 2015. Rick was there for all of it. He gave a toast at our wedding that made Angela's father cry. He sent flowers to the hospital when Maya was born. He came to our house for Thanksgiving dinners and Sunday barbecues. He was family, or at least that's what I believed. Looking back now, I can see the signs I missed. I can see the small inconsistencies, the moments when Rick's mask slipped just enough to reveal something darker underneath. But at the time, I was too grateful, too loyal, too blinded by the life he had helped me build to question anything. That's the thing about manipulation. It works best on the people who want to believe in you. And I wanted to believe in Rick more than I had ever wanted anything. The first real crack appeared in early 2018. By then, Callahan and Associates had grown from that cramped office on Wacker Drive to a gleaming headquarters in the Willis Tower, with over 200 employees and clients across North America. I was overseeing a portfolio of our biggest accounts, working 60-hour weeks and bringing in more revenue than any other VP in the company. Rick had started talking about succession planning, about eventually transitioning me into a CEO role while he moved into a chairman position. It felt like everything I had worked for was finally coming together. And then I met Tom Bradley. Tom had been with the company almost as long as Rick, serving as chief financial officer since the early days, but our paths had rarely crossed. He worked on the numbers side, I worked on the client side, and there was an unspoken divide between the two departments. But in February of 2018, Rick asked me to sit in on a financial review meeting, said he wanted me to start getting more exposure to the full scope of company operations. I was flattered. I should have been suspicious. The meeting was routine, or at least it appeared to be. Quarterly earnings, projected growth, budget allocations for the coming fiscal year. But about an hour in, Tom mentioned something that caught my attention. He referred to our special accounts, using a tone of voice that seemed deliberately casual, almost rehearsed. When I asked him to clarify what special accounts meant, the room went very quiet. Rick cleared his throat and explained that these were discretionary funds used for client entertainment and relationship building. Nothing unusual for a company our size, he said, just a standard practice that didn't require VP-level oversight. I nodded and let it go. But that night, I couldn't stop thinking about the way Tom had looked at Rick when I asked my question. The quick glance, the subtle nod, the way Rick's answer had come just a little too smoothly. Something was wrong. I could feel it the same way I had felt those duplicate bank envelopes in the mailroom all those years ago. But this time, I decided to trust Rick. This time, I convinced myself that my instincts were betraying me, that I was being paranoid, that the man who had given me everything wouldn't keep secrets from me. That was my first mistake. The second mistake came a year later, when I ignored what Elena Vasquez tried to tell me. Elena had joined the company in 2016 as a compliance analyst, one of those thankless positions where you spend all day making sure the company is following regulations that nobody else wants to think about. She was good at her job, almost too good, with a habit of asking uncomfortable questions during staff meetings and refusing to accept vague answers. I liked her immediately. She reminded me of myself when I was younger, before I learned to pick my battles, before I understood that sometimes the smart move is to stay quiet and watch. In March of 2019, Elena requested a private meeting with me. She looked nervous, which was unusual for her. She kept glancing at the door of my office as if she expected someone to burst in at any moment. When I asked her what was wrong, she took a deep breath and said she had found something in the company's financial records that didn't add up. She said she had discovered a pattern of transactions that appeared to route client funds through shell companies before returning them to the main accounts at reduced values. She said it looked like someone was skimming money from client restructuring deals, small amounts at first, but growing larger over the past 3 years. She said she was scared to take it to anyone else because she didn't know who was involved. I sat there for a long moment, processing what she had told me. Part of me wanted to believe her. Part of me knew, deep down, that what she was describing connected to those special accounts Tom had mentioned a year earlier. But another part of me, the part that owed everything to Rick, the part that still wanted to see him as a mentor and a father figure, refused to accept the implications. I told Elena that I would look into it. I told her to sit tight and not mention her findings to anyone else until I had a chance to investigate. And then I did something that I will regret for the rest of my life. I went to Rick's office, sat down across from his desk, and told him exactly what Elena had discovered. Rick listened carefully, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he thanked me for bringing it to his attention. He said he appreciated my loyalty. He said he would have Tom look into the allegations immediately, and assured me that there was probably a simple explanation, some kind of accounting error or misunderstanding. He told me not to worry. 2 weeks later, Elena Vasquez was terminated for what the company called consistent performance issues and failure to maintain professional standards. She cleaned out her desk on a Friday afternoon while security stood nearby, and when she walked past my office, she looked at me with an expression that I can still see when I close my eyes. It wasn't anger. It was disappointment. It was the look of someone who had trusted the wrong person and paid the price. I should have done something. I should have spoken up, fought back, demanded an explanation. Instead, I told myself that Rick knew what he was doing. I told myself that Elena must have been wrong about the financial irregularities, that her termination was unfortunate but justified. I told myself anything and everything that would allow me to keep believing in the man who had shaped my entire career. For the next 3 years, I continued playing the role of the loyal protege. I worked harder than ever, brought in record-breaking client contracts, and watched as Rick publicly groomed me as his eventual successor. But something had changed between us, something subtle that I couldn't quite name. Rick started including me in fewer high-level meetings. He assigned me to long-term projects that kept me traveling for weeks at a time. He smiled just as warmly, praised me just as generously, but there was a distance now, a wall that hadn't existed before. I convinced myself it was just the natural evolution of our relationship, that Rick was giving me more autonomy to prepare me for leadership. I was wrong. Rick was isolating me. He was keeping me busy and distracted while he prepared the trap that would eventually snap shut around my life. The first sign of real trouble came in August of 2022. I was in New York for a client meeting when I received an unusual phone call from my assistant Janet. She sounded flustered, almost panicked, as she explained that 2 investigators from the Illinois Attorney General's office had shown up at the company's headquarters requesting documents related to several of our client accounts. Rick had handled the situation personally, she said, assuring the investigators that Callahan and Associates would fully cooperate with any inquiry. But Janet said something about the whole thing felt wrong. She said Rick had immediately gone into a closed-door meeting with Tom Bradley and Sarah Mitchell from HR, and they had been locked in his office for over 4 hours. When I got back to Chicago 2 days later, Rick acted as if nothing had happened. He mentioned the investigators briefly, dismissively, explaining that it was a routine inquiry related to one of our former clients, who was facing unrelated legal issues. Nothing to worry about, he said. These things happen in our industry. Stay focused on your work. But I couldn't stay focused. Something about his explanation didn't sit right. Why would investigators from the Attorney General's office show up in person for a routine inquiry? Why would Rick spend 4 hours behind closed doors with the CFO and the HR director? Why did Janet sound so nervous on the phone? I started paying closer attention. I started asking questions I had never asked before. I started looking at documents I had previously ignored. And slowly, piece by piece, I began to understand the truth. The special accounts that Tom had mentioned years earlier were real. They existed, and they contained millions of dollars that had been systematically siphoned from client restructuring deals over the past decade. The money was being funneled through a network of shell companies based in Delaware and the Cayman Islands, companies that I eventually traced back to an offshore trust controlled by Richard Callahan and his wife Diane. Elena Vasquez had been right all along. She had found the evidence of a massive financial fraud, and when I brought her findings to Rick, he had silenced her and begun the process of covering his tracks. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst part, the part that made me feel physically sick when I discovered it, was what Rick had done to protect himself. He hadn't just hidden the fraud. He had created a scapegoat. He had spent years positioning someone else to take the fall if the scheme was ever discovered. That someone was me. I found the evidence on a Thursday night in late September 2022. I had stayed late at the office, waiting until everyone else had gone home, and used my executive access to enter Rick's private files. It took me hours of searching, but eventually I found a hidden folder buried within layers of encrypted subfolders. Inside were documents that made my blood run cold, forged authorization forms with my signature, email threads that appeared to show me directing the establishment of the shell companies, bank account applications listing me as the beneficial owner, transfer requests that seemed to prove I had personally ordered the movement of client funds. Everything was fake, expertly fabricated, but convincing enough to destroy my life if it ever reached investigators. Rick had been building this false evidence for years. Every time he praised me publicly, every time he promoted me, every time he brought me closer to the center of the company, he was also adding another layer to the frame. He had turned my success into a weapon. The higher I rose, the more plausible it would seem that I had the access and the motive to commit the fraud. And when the time came, when the investigators got too close, and Rick needed someone to sacrifice, everything would point directly at Marcus Thompson, the grateful kid from Englewood who Rick had rescued from the mailroom. I sat alone in Rick's office that night for over an hour, staring at the evidence of my own destruction. I thought about Angela and Maya. I thought about my parents, who were so proud of everything I had accomplished. I thought about the life I had built, the reputation I had earned, and how easily it could all be erased by a man I had trusted completely. And I thought about what I should do next. The logical move would have been to go straight to the authorities, take everything I had found, hire a lawyer, and let the legal system sort out the truth. But I knew Rick well enough to understand that he had planned for that possibility too. He had connections everywhere, judges and politicians who owed him favors, media contacts who would spin any story in his direction. If I came forward prematurely, before I had gathered enough evidence to prove his guilt beyond any shadow of doubt, Rick would destroy me before I ever got the chance to tell my side. The forged documents would appear, the fake email trails would be discovered, and I would spend the rest of my life trying to prove my innocence from inside a federal prison cell. No, if I wanted to survive this, if I wanted to protect my family and expose the truth, I needed to be smarter than Rick. I needed to think 3 steps ahead. I needed to build my case quietly, patiently. without giving him any indication that I knew what he had done. I needed to find allies I could trust. And most importantly, I needed to find Elena Vasquez. It took me almost 2 weeks to track Elena down. After her termination from Callahan and Associates, she had essentially disappeared from the professional world. Her LinkedIn profile was deactivated. Her phone number was disconnected. The address listed in her personnel file led to an apartment building where no one by her name had lived for over a year, but I was persistent. I knew that Elena was too smart and too stubborn to simply vanish. She was out there somewhere, and I was betting that she still had copies of the evidence she had tried to show me 3 years earlier. I finally found her through a former colleague who had kept in touch. Elena was living in Milwaukee now, working as a freelance financial consultant for small businesses. She had left Chicago after her termination, unable to find work in her field, after Rick had quietly destroyed her professional reputation. She had been labeled as difficult and unreliable by reference checks that came directly from Callahan and Associates. Her career in corporate compliance was effectively over, all because she had tried to do the right thing, and I had been too blind to help her. When I showed up at her apartment on a rainy Saturday morning, Elena didn't seem surprised to see me. She invited me in, made coffee, and sat across from me at her small kitchen table with an expression that was equal parts vindication and wariness. She asked me why I was there, and I told her the truth. I told her everything I had discovered, everything Rick had done, everything he was planning to do to me. I apologized for not believing her 3 years ago. I apologized for putting my loyalty to Rick above my trust in her instincts. I apologized for letting her get destroyed while I protected myself. Elena listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached into a drawer, pulled out a thick manila envelope, and slid it across the table. Inside were copies of every document she had found before her termination. Financial records, transaction histories, corporate filings for the shell companies, even a recorded phone conversation between Tom Bradley and an unnamed party discussing how to clean up the accounts before the quarterly review. Elena had kept everything, knowing that someday, somehow, the truth would need to come out. We spent the rest of that day comparing notes and building a timeline. Elena's evidence from 3 years ago, combined with what I had discovered in Rick's files, painted a comprehensive picture of the fraud, but we both knew it wasn't enough. We needed more. We needed to connect Rick directly to the offshore accounts. We needed to prove that the documents implicating me were forgeries, and we needed to do it all without alerting Rick that we were onto him. Over the next 2 months, Elena and I worked together in secret. I continued my normal routine at Callahan and Associates, showing up every day, attending meetings, smiling at Rick across conference tables as if nothing had changed. Meanwhile, Elena used her compliance expertise to trace the money trails through layers of corporate shells. She made contact with a forensic accountant who specialized in fraud detection. She reached out to former employees of the shell companies who might be willing to talk. Slowly, carefully, we assembled the pieces of a case that would be impossible to dismiss. But we weren't the only ones paying attention. In early December, I started noticing small changes in how people treated me at work. Conversations would stop abruptly when I entered a room. Colleagues who had been friendly for years suddenly became distant and evasive. Sarah Mitchell from HR requested an unexpected meeting to review my personnel file, asking strange questions about my early years at the company and my relationship with Rick. I realized with a chill that Rick was laying the groundwork. He was preparing the people around me to believe the narrative he had constructed. When the time came for my downfall, everyone would say they had always suspected something about Marcus Thompson. I also noticed that Rick was spending more time with Tom Bradley behind closed doors. Their conversations would end abruptly whenever I approached. Once, passing Tom's office late in the evening, I overheard him say something that made me freeze in my tracks. He said, "The timeline has to move up. We can't wait until spring." I didn't hear Rick's response, but I didn't need to. They were accelerating their plan. Whatever they had intended to do to me in a few months, they were going to do it sooner. I called Elena that night and told her we were running out of time. She agreed. We had gathered enough evidence to prove fraud, but we still couldn't definitively prove that I was being framed. The forged documents in Rick's hidden files could be explained away as some kind of misunderstanding, an administrative error, anything that Rick's lawyers could spin in his favor. We needed something more. We needed someone on the inside who could testify to what was really happening. That's when I thought of Diane Callahan. I had always liked Rick's wife. She was elegant and intelligent, with a sharp sense of humor that she carefully concealed behind a facade of perfect corporate spouse. Over the years, I had watched her at company events, making small talk with clients, laughing at Rick's jokes, playing her role flawlessly. But I had also noticed something else. I had noticed the way her smile never quite reached her eyes when she looked at her husband. I had noticed the subtle tension between them at social gatherings, the way she would sometimes excuse herself early with vague complaints about headaches, and I had noticed more recently that Diane's name appeared on several of the offshore trust documents, positioned as a secondary beneficiary with limited access to the funds. It was a gamble. Diane might be completely loyal to Rick, might warn him immediately that I was asking questions, but my instincts told me otherwise. My instincts told me that Diane Callahan knew more than she let on, and that she had her own reasons for wanting her husband exposed. I arranged to accidentally run into Diane at a charity luncheon in mid-December. It was an event she attended every year, one that Rick usually skipped because he considered such functions a waste of time. I arrived early, positioned myself near the bar where Diane typically collected her glass of white wine, and waited. When she appeared, I smiled and greeted her as if the encounter were a pleasant surprise. We made small talk about the holidays, about Maya's recent school play, about the unseasonably warm weather, and then carefully I mentioned that I had been doing some research into the company's historical finances for a project Rick had assigned me. I mentioned that I had come across some interesting documents. I mentioned that I hoped she might be able to help me understand certain details about the offshore accounts. Diane's expression didn't change, but I saw something flicker in her eyes. It might have been fear. It might have been recognition. She excused herself gracefully, claimed she needed to greet another guest, and walked away. I thought I had made a terrible mistake, but 3 days later, I received a handwritten note delivered to my home address. It contained a single sentence and a phone number. The sentence read, "They meet at the lake house, first Saturday of every month." I called the number that evening. Diane answered on the second ring. Her voice was calm, controlled, but underneath I could hear something else. Resolve. She told me that she had been waiting for years for someone to finally ask the right questions. She told me that she had discovered Rick's affair with Sarah Mitchell 2 years ago, and that when she confronted him, he had laughed and informed her that she was trapped. The offshore trusts were in both their names. If she tried to leave him or expose the fraud, she would go to prison right alongside him. He had made her complicit without her knowledge, forged her signatures on documents, used her social security number to establish accounts she knew nothing about. She had been living in a gilded cage, terrified and furious, waiting for an opportunity to escape. Diane told me everything. She told me about the monthly meetings at their lake house in Wisconsin, where Rick and Tom Bradley would review the accounts and plan their next moves. She told me about the hidden safe in Rick's study that contained physical copies of documents too dangerous to keep on computer servers. She told me about a confrontation she had overheard between Rick and Sarah Mitchell, where Sarah had demanded more money in exchange for her continued silence about the HR records that had been falsified to eliminate whistleblowers like Elena. And she told me about the plan to frame me, which Rick had discussed openly in front of her because he never imagined she would betray him. For the first time since I had discovered the truth in Rick's files, I felt something like hope. Diane was willing to testify. She was willing to provide access to the lake house safe. She was willing to help me prove, once and for all, that Richard Callahan was a fraud and a criminal who had systematically destroyed innocent people to protect his wealth. But there was one more thing I needed. I needed to get Rick on record. I needed him to admit, in his own words, what he had done to me and why. And I knew exactly how to make that happen. The Callahan and Associates annual holiday party was scheduled for December 21st. It was the company's biggest social event of the year, held at a luxury hotel downtown with live music, gourmet catering, and an open bar that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Every executive attended, every major client was invited, and every year, without fail, Rick gave a speech where he praised the company's achievements and paid special tribute to the employees who had contributed most to its success. This year, I knew he would single me out. He would stand in front of 500 people and talk about what a wonderful protege I had been, how proud he was of everything I had accomplished, and he would have no idea that I was recording every word. In the days leading up to the party, I made my final preparations. Elena and I rehearsed the next steps of our plan. Diane confirmed that Rick would be relaxed and slightly overconfident after his speech, the perfect state for manipulation. I arranged for a trusted colleague to keep Tom Bradley occupied during the critical window, and I obtained a small recording device, legal to possess in Illinois under our one-party consent laws, that I concealed in my jacket pocket. The night of the party arrived. Angela kissed me goodbye at the door, telling me to have fun and bring home some of those fancy desserts for Maya. I smiled and promised I would, not telling her that I was about to do something that would change all of our lives. I drove downtown through light snow, parked in the hotel garage, and walked into the glittering ballroom with my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Rick found me almost immediately. He was in an expansive mood, laughing loudly, clapping people on the back, playing the role of benevolent patriarch to perfection. He pulled me aside near the bar and handed me a glass of champagne. "Marcus," he said, his voice warm and paternal, "I want you to know something. I've been thinking about the future, about what comes next for this company, and I've decided that it's time to start the formal succession process. By this time next year, you're going to be sitting in my chair. You've earned it. You've given this company everything, and I want to make sure you get what you deserve." I looked at him, this man who had shaped my career, who had attended my wedding, who had held my daughter, and I saw him clearly for the first time. I saw the calculation behind the warmth. I saw the manipulation beneath the praise. I saw a man who was putting his arm around my shoulders while preparing to put a knife in my back. "Thank you, Rick," I said, keeping my voice steady. "That means everything to me. You've been like a father to me." His smile widened. He had no idea that the recording device in my pocket was capturing every word. An hour later, after his speech had ended to thunderous applause and the crowd had dispersed into smaller groups, I found Rick alone in a quiet corridor near the service entrance. He was checking his phone, probably reviewing the evening's social media coverage. I approached him casually, as if I simply wanted to continue our earlier conversation. "Rick, can I ask you something? It's about those special accounts Tom mentioned a few years ago." His expression flickered just for a moment before settling back into practiced ease. "Of course, Marcus. What about them?" "I've been doing some housekeeping on my files, getting ready for the transition, and I found some documents that I don't understand. Authorization forms that seem to have my signature, but I don't remember signing them. Bank accounts that list me as the owner, but I've never seen them before. I'm sure there's an explanation, but it's been bothering me." The corridor was silent except for the muffled sound of music from the ballroom. Rick studied my face for a long moment, his eyes sharp and calculating. I could almost see him weighing his options, deciding how to play this. "Marcus," he said finally, his voice dropping to something almost gentle, "you're a smart man, one of the smartest I've ever known. But sometimes smart people see things they shouldn't see. And when that happens, the smart play is to forget what you saw and focus on what matters: your family, your future, the life you've built." I don't understand. I think you do. He moved closer, lowering his voice further. Those accounts exist for a reason. They've been very profitable for this company, and for the people who know how to keep their mouths shut about them. Now, you can choose to ask more questions. You can make noise, create problems, force uncomfortable conversations. But if you do that, I guarantee you won't like where those conversations lead, because those documents you found, the ones with your signature, there are a lot more where those came from. And they tell a very convincing story about a young executive who got greedy and betrayed the man who gave him everything. My heart was racing, but I kept my face neutral. Are you saying you'll frame me for something you did? Rick smiled, and for the first time I saw the monster behind the mask. I'm saying that loyalty is a two-way street, Marcus. I gave you everything: your career, your education, your comfortable life in that nice house with your beautiful wife and daughter. All I asked in return was for you to keep your head down and do your job. But you couldn't do that, could you? You had to start digging. You had to start asking questions. Just like that Vasquez woman. And look where that got her. You destroyed her career, I said quietly. She was trying to do the right thing, and you ruined her life. I protected this company. I protected myself. And if you had any sense, you would stop this conversation right now and go back to the party and pretend it never happened. Because I promise you, Marcus, if you try to expose me, I will burn your life to the ground. I will take everything you love. And when I'm done, no one will remember you as anything but a thief. He said it so casually, so confidently, as if he genuinely believed he was untouchable. And in that moment, I understood something fundamental about Richard Callahan. He had been getting away with things his entire life. His wealth, his connections, his charm had always protected him from consequences. He had never faced someone who was willing to sacrifice everything to bring him down. I looked at him, this man who had once been my hero, and I smiled. "Thank you, Rick," I said. "I think I understand now." He patted my shoulder, apparently satisfied that he had frightened me into submission, and walked back toward the ballroom. He had no idea that every word of our conversation was saved on the device in my pocket. He had no idea that Diane was waiting at the lake house, ready to give us access to the physical evidence. He had no idea that Elena and I had already compiled a comprehensive case file and delivered copies to 3 separate attorneys, the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, and a respected investigative journalist who specialized in corporate fraud. Richard Callahan thought he was untouchable. He was about to learn how wrong he was. Part 2. The morning after the holiday party, I sat with Angela at our kitchen table and told her everything. I had kept her in the dark for months, trying to protect her from the stress and uncertainty of what I was uncovering. But now that we had Rick's confession on tape, now that the wheels were in motion, I couldn't keep it secret any longer. She deserved to know what was about to happen. She deserved to make an informed choice about whether to stand with me through what was coming. Angela listened without interrupting while Maya played in the next room, building something elaborate with her blocks. When I finished, my wife was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached across the table, took my hand, and said something I will never forget. She said, "Marcus, I didn't marry you because of your job title or your salary. I married you because you're a good man, and good men don't let people like Rick Callahan win. Whatever happens next, we face it together." I don't think I've ever loved her more than I did in that moment. The next phase of our plan required patience and precision. We had the evidence. We had witnesses willing to testify. We had Rick's own words, recorded and preserved, admitting to fraud and threatening to frame an innocent man. But we also knew that Rick had powerful allies who would try to bury the story if they caught wind of it too early. We needed to move strategically, timing our revelations for maximum impact and minimum opportunity for interference. Elena and I spent the week between Christmas and New Year's coordinating with our network of contacts. The FBI agents assigned to our case were cautious but interested, recognizing that we were handing them a significant white-collar crime prosecution on a silver platter. The investigative journalist, a woman named Patricia Chen, who had broken several major corporate fraud stories over the past decade, was eager to publish but agreed to hold her story until we gave the signal, and the attorneys we had consulted were working to ensure that my cooperation with the investigation would provide me full protection from any attempt by Rick to implement his frame-up plan. The most delicate piece of the puzzle was Diane. She had agreed to help us, but she was still living with Rick, still playing the role of loyal wife while secretly gathering additional evidence. Every day she spent in that house was a risk. If Rick discovered what she was doing, the consequences could be severe. But Diane insisted on staying until we had everything we needed. She said she had spent too many years being afraid of her husband, and she wasn't going to let fear stop her from watching him fall. On January 3rd, Diane called me with news that changed everything. She had overheard Rick on the phone with Tom Bradley, discussing an emergency meeting with their lawyers for the following week. Apparently, the Attorney General's office had expanded their investigation, and someone inside the company had been feeding them information. Rick was worried. For the first time since Diane had known him, he was genuinely afraid. He had told Tom that they might need to accelerate the contingency plan, which Diane understood to mean activating the frame against me. We couldn't wait any longer. If Rick moved first, if he managed to plant the forged evidence before we could expose him, it would become his word against mine. The very power and connections that had protected him for decades would be turned against me. I would become the villain in a story he had written years ago, and no one would believe the truth. I called an emergency meeting with Elena, our FBI contact, and Patricia Chen. We convened in a small conference room at a downtown law office, doors locked, phones off, speaking in low voices as if Rick might somehow be listening. The consensus was clear. We had to move now. The investigation was ready to go public. Patricia's story was written and fact-checked. The FBI had enough evidence to execute search warrants on Callahan and Associates, the lake house, and Rick's personal residence. All we were waiting for was the green light. I gave it. The next 48 hours were a blur of activity. FBI agents raided the Callahan and Associates headquarters at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, arriving in unmarked vehicles and filing through the front doors before anyone could sound an alarm. They served warrants on Tom Bradley, seizing his computer and personal devices. They collected boxes of documents from Rick's office, including the hidden files where the forged evidence against me was stored. They interviewed employees, including several who had been involved in covering up Elena's termination years earlier. Simultaneously, another team executed a warrant at the lake house in Wisconsin. Diane had provided detailed instructions about the hidden safe in Rick's study, and the agents found exactly what she had promised: physical copies of the offshore trust documents, bank account statements showing the flow of stolen funds, a handwritten ledger kept by Rick himself, documenting the amount skimmed from each client account over the past 12 years. It was a treasure trove of evidence, enough to build a case that no lawyer could argue away. Rick was arrested at his home that same morning. I wasn't there to see it, but Diane described it to me later with something close to satisfaction in her voice. She said Rick had been in his bathrobe, drinking coffee and reading the Tribune, when the doorbell rang. She said he had opened the door expecting a delivery, only to find 4 FBI agents with badges and handcuffs. She said his face went completely white, the color draining away as he finally understood that his untouchable existence was over. Tom Bradley was arrested at the office an hour later, still sitting in the conference room, where agents had confined him during their search. Sarah Mitchell was taken into custody that afternoon, after investigators found evidence that she had personally falsified HR records to conceal the retaliation against Elena and other potential whistleblowers. By the end of the day, the entire criminal conspiracy at Callahan and Associates was in custody, awaiting arraignment on charges including fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Patricia Chen's story broke that evening, dominating the news cycle and spreading across social media with unstoppable momentum. The headline read, Chicago consulting titan arrested in massive fraud scheme. The article detailed everything: the stolen client funds, the shell companies, the frame up plot, the brave whistleblower who had been destroyed for speaking the truth. Patricia had interviewed Elena extensively, giving her the chance to finally tell her story and restore her reputation. She had included quotes from Diane, who had agreed to speak publicly about her husband's crimes and her own role in exposing them, and she had featured my account prominently, describing how I had been targeted for destruction by the man who had pretended to mentor me. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Former clients of Callahan and Associates came forward with their own stories of suspicious dealings. Employees who had kept silent for years found the courage to speak up. Industry organizations launched investigations into their own compliance procedures, wondering how such blatant fraud had gone undetected for so long. And throughout it all, Richard Callahan's name became synonymous with betrayal, a cautionary tale about the monsters who hide behind expensive suits and charming smiles. But the legal process was just beginning. Rick and his co-conspirators were arraigned on multiple federal charges, with bail set at amounts that shocked even the wealthiest observers. Rick's assets were frozen pending investigation, including the offshore accounts where he had stashed millions in stolen funds. His wife filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences and seeking to have her name removed from any financial structures she had been enrolled in without her knowledge or consent. His children, two adults from his first marriage who had always been distant, released statements condemning his actions and asking for privacy. His reputation, carefully cultivated over 30 years, collapsed in a matter of days. The trial began 11 months later, after extensive pretrial motions and legal maneuvering. I was called as a witness on the third day, walking into the federal courtroom, with my heart pounding and my palms damp with nervous sweat. The gallery was packed with reporters, former colleagues, and curious members of the public who wanted to see the man who had exposed Richard Callahan. And at the defense table, wearing an expensive suit and an expression of practiced confidence, sat Rick himself, looking at me with eyes that held nothing but cold hatred. The prosecutor walked me through my testimony step by step. I described my early years at the company, my rise through the ranks, my trust in Rick's mentorship. I described the first signs of wrongdoing, Elena's warnings that I had foolishly ignored. I described discovering the forged documents, the terrifying realization that I was being set up to take the fall. I described the confrontation at the holiday party, playing the recording for the jury while Rick sat stone-faced and silent. And I described the months of secret investigation, the alliance with Elena and Diane, the careful assembly of evidence that had brought us to this moment. The cross-examination was brutal. Rick's defense attorney, a high-priced specialist in white-collar cases, attacked my credibility from every angle. She suggested that I was a disgruntled employee seeking revenge. She implied that I had fabricated the recording using audio manipulation software. She pointed out inconsistencies in my timeline, gaps in my documentation, moments where my testimony conflicted with physical evidence. She painted a picture of a man who had betrayed his mentor and was now trying to frame an innocent executive to cover his own crimes. But I held firm. I answered every question honestly, admitted the things I didn't know, refused to be baited into anger or confusion. And when the defense attorney pressed me on why I had waited so long to come forward, I looked directly at the jury and told them the truth. I told them that I had believed in Richard Callahan. I told them that trusting him was the biggest mistake of my life. I told them that exposing him was the hardest thing I had ever done. But I did it because innocent people were being hurt, because the truth matters more than comfort, because some betrayals are too profound to forgive. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The jury deliberated for 3 days, and on a cold February morning, the foreman stood and read the verdicts. Richard Callahan, guilty on all counts. Thomas Bradley, guilty on all counts. Sarah Mitchell, guilty on 7 counts, not guilty on 2. The courtroom erupted. Reporters rushed for the exits, desperate to file their stories. and I sat in the gallery, watching as federal marshals approached the defense table to take Rick into custody, finally allowing myself to believe that it was really over. Rick was sentenced 4 months later to 23 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole. Tom Bradley received 18 years. Sarah Mitchell received 8. The judge, delivering the sentences, spoke at length about the severity of the crimes, the betrayal of trust, the destruction of innocent lives. She praised the courage of the witnesses who had come forward and expressed hope that the case would serve as a warning to others who might consider similar schemes. Diane's cooperation with the investigation earned her immunity from prosecution, though she faced years of civil litigation from defrauded clients seeking to recover their losses. She sold the house in Lake Forest, moved to a small town in Vermont, and cut ties with virtually everyone from her former life. The last I heard, she was volunteering at a local library and had started taking art classes. She seemed, for the first time in decades, genuinely happy. Elena rebuilt her career with the help of the publicity surrounding the case. Her story of wrongful termination and vindication attracted the attention of corporate governance advocates across the country. She started a consulting firm specializing in whistleblower protection, helping other employees who found themselves in situations similar to hers. We stayed in touch, meeting occasionally for coffee or dinner, our friendship forged in the fire of shared struggle. She told me once that she didn't regret any of it, not the lost years, not the destroyed career, not the fear and isolation she had endured. She said the truth was worth the price. I believed her. And as for me, life after the trial was strange and disorienting in ways I hadn't anticipated. The company I had devoted 16 years to building no longer existed. Callahan and Associates was dissolved in bankruptcy proceedings, its assets liquidated to compensate defrauded clients, its name permanently tainted by scandal. My professional network, the connections and relationships I had cultivated over nearly 2 decades, largely evaporated. People who had praised my work and sought my advice suddenly didn't return phone calls. Former colleagues crossed the street to avoid meeting my eyes. I spent several months in a kind of limbo, unsure of what to do next. Angela was patient, supportive, reminding me that I had done the right thing, and that the right thing isn't always rewarded immediately. Maya, now 8 years old, and old enough to understand that something significant had happened, asked me once why I seemed sad sometimes. I told her that Daddy had to deal with something very hard at work, but that everything was going to be okay. She hugged me and said she was proud of me. I held her for a long time, grateful beyond words for the family that had stood by me through everything. Eventually, I started to rebuild. A former client who had watched the trial reached out with a consulting opportunity. Then another. Then a small group of investors approached me about starting a new firm, one founded on principles of transparency and accountability. I was skeptical at first, wary of returning to an industry that had almost destroyed me. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that walking away would mean letting Rick win. He had tried to take everything from me. The best revenge wasn't just watching him rot in prison. The best revenge was thriving in spite of what he had done. We launched the new company, Thompson Advisory Group, in the spring of the following year. It was small at first, just 5 employees working out of a modest office space in the Loop, but it grew steadily, built on a reputation for integrity that set us apart in an industry still recovering from scandal. Clients sought us out specifically because of my story, because they knew that a man who had sacrificed everything to expose fraud would never betray their trust. It wasn't the meteoric rise I had experienced under Rick's mentorship, but it was real. It was mine, and nobody could take it away. 3 years after Rick's conviction, I received a letter. It was handwritten, postmarked from the Federal Correctional Institution in Terre Haute, Indiana. The return address bore Rick's name and inmate number. I stared at the envelope for a long time. Before opening it, my hands trembling slightly with a mixture of curiosity and residual fear. The letter was 4 pages long, Rick had written it in the cramped, precise handwriting I remembered from countless memos and contracts. He began by acknowledging that I probably wouldn't read it, that I had every reason to throw it away unopened, but he felt compelled to write anyway. He said that 3 years in prison had given him time to think about the choices he had made and the people he had hurt. He said he understood now that what he had done to me was unforgivable, that no explanation or apology could undo the damage, but he wanted me to know that he was sorry, genuinely sorry, not for getting caught, but for becoming the kind of person who could betray someone who trusted him completely. He wrote about his childhood, about the pressure he had felt growing up wealthy, about the fear of failure that had driven him to cut corners and justify increasingly unethical behavior. He wrote about the moment he decided to start skimming from client accounts, how easy it had seemed at first, how the small thefts had grown into a massive fraud before he fully understood what he had become. He wrote about me specifically, about watching me rise from the mailroom, about genuinely caring for me even as he planned to destroy me. He said that was the part that haunted him most. He had loved me like a son, and he had still been willing to sacrifice me to save himself. The letter ended with a request. Rick asked if I would consider visiting him. He said he didn't expect forgiveness, didn't deserve it, but he wanted the chance to look me in the eye and say the things he had written. He said he would understand if I refused. He said he would understand if I never responded at all, but he had to ask. I read the letter 3 times, searching for manipulation, for some hidden angle, but I couldn't find one. The words seemed genuine, the contrition real. For a brief moment, I actually considered going. I imagined sitting across from Rick in a sterile prison visiting room, listening to him explain himself, maybe finding some kind of closure. Then I thought about Elena, whose career he had destroyed. I thought about the employees who lost their jobs when the company collapsed. I thought about the clients whose retirement funds had been stolen. I thought about Angela, crying with relief when the verdict was announced. I thought about Maya, too young to fully understand, but old enough to sense that something terrible had happened to her father. And I thought about myself at 22, sorting mail in the basement of a cramped office, believing that the charismatic man upstairs represented everything I wanted to become. That young man had been so desperate for guidance, so eager for approval, so willing to give his loyalty to anyone who showed him kindness. Rick had taken that vulnerability and exploited it for 16 years. He had made me complicit in his image of success while secretly constructing my downfall. And now, from his prison cell, he wanted absolution. I didn't respond to the letter. I didn't visit. Instead, I took the 4 handwritten pages, walked out to the grill on our back patio, and watched them burn. The smoke rose into the clear spring sky, carrying Rick's words away until nothing remained but ash. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't rage. It was simply the final closing of a door that should have been shut long ago. Life continued. Maya grew older, asking more sophisticated questions about what had happened and what it meant. I answered her honestly, at a level appropriate for her age, teaching her about trust and betrayal and the importance of doing right even when it costs you everything. Angela and I celebrated our 10th anniversary with a quiet dinner at the restaurant where we'd had our first date. My parents, both in their 70s now, finally stopped asking when I was going to get a real job and started expressing pride in what I had built. My sisters, who had followed my career with a mixture of awe and worry, brought their families to Chicago for a reunion where nobody mentioned Rick's name even once. Thompson Advisory Group continued to grow. We hired new analysts, expanded into additional offices, took on larger and more complex client engagements. I found myself traveling less than I had at Callahan and Associates, spending more time at home, present for the everyday moments I had missed during those years of chasing success under Rick's guidance. I coached Maya's soccer team. I took cooking classes with Angela. I even found time to reconnect with old friends from Inglewood, people I had lost touch with during my climb up the corporate ladder. Sometimes late at night, I still thought about Rick. I wondered if he was genuinely reformed, or if the letter had been one last attempt at manipulation. I wondered if he thought about me, rotting away in that federal prison, watching the years of his sentence tick by with agonizing slowness. I wondered if he ever truly understood the magnitude of what he had done, or if he remained, deep down, the same entitled man who believed rules were for other people. But mostly, I thought about the lessons I had learned. I thought about how close I had come to destruction, how easily Rick could have succeeded in framing me, how my entire life could have unraveled because I trusted the wrong person. I thought about Elena, who had seen the truth when I was too blind to look. I thought about Diane, trapped in a marriage to a monster, gathering courage for years until the moment came to strike. I thought about all the people who had helped me, who had believed me, who had stood by me when everything seemed hopeless. Betrayal changes you. It makes you suspicious in ways you never were before, careful with your trust, vigilant for signs of deception. For a long time after the trial, I found it difficult to believe in anyone's good intentions. I questioned colleagues who offered help. I doubted friends who expressed support. I saw potential enemies everywhere, hidden agendas behind every kind word. It was exhausting, and it was lonely, and it took years of conscious effort to learn how to trust again. But I did learn. Slowly, painfully, I rebuilt my capacity for faith in other people. I learned to distinguish between reasonable caution and paranoid isolation. I learned that some people are genuine, that not everyone wearing a mask hides a monster underneath. I learned that the answer to betrayal isn't becoming incapable of connection. The answer is becoming wiser about who deserves your loyalty. 5 years after Rick's conviction, I was invited to speak at a conference for corporate ethics professionals. The organizers wanted me to tell my story, to share the lessons I had learned about fraud, whistleblowing, and the importance of internal controls. I was nervous about accepting. Public speaking had never been my strength, and revisiting the trauma of those years still triggered difficult emotions. But Elena encouraged me to do it. She said that my story could help other people, could give courage to employees who suspected wrongdoing but feared the consequences of speaking up. She said that staying silent was letting Rick win one more time. So I accepted. I flew to Denver, checked into a hotel near the convention center, and spent the night before my presentation staring at the ceiling and wondering what I was going to say. The prepared remarks on my laptop felt stale, sanitized, stripped of the real pain and fear and triumph. I wanted to tell the audience something true, something that would actually matter, but I didn't know how to compress 16 years of complex emotion into a 45-minute keynote. The next morning, I walked onto the stage in front of 3,000 professionals in matching conference badges. The lights were blinding, the applause was deafening, and as I looked out at all those faces, strangers who had come to hear my story, I made a decision. I closed my laptop. I pushed aside the prepared remarks, and I simply started talking. I told them about being 22 years old in the mailroom, desperate for a chance, and willing to give everything to anyone who offered it. I told them about the slow seduction of success, the way Rick made me feel special and chosen, while secretly setting me up to fail. I told them about the moment I discovered the truth, sitting alone in his office, surrounded by evidence of his plans to destroy me. I told them about the fear, the anger, the doubt, the overwhelming temptation to simply run away and start over somewhere else. And I told them about the decision to fight back, to risk everything I had built, to trust that the truth would ultimately prevail. When I finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Then someone started clapping, and the applause spread, building until it filled the entire convention hall. People rose to their feet. I saw tears on some faces, recognition on others, and I understood for the first time that my story wasn't just about revenge, it was about survival. It was about refusing to let someone else's cruelty define your life. It was about finding the strength to keep going when everything tells you to give up. After the presentation, I was surrounded by attendees who wanted to shake my hand, to thank me, to share their own stories. A young woman told me she was dealing with a situation similar to Elena's and didn't know what to do. I gave her Elena's contact information and promised that she would help. An older man told me he had worked at Callahan and Associates in the early days and had always suspected something was wrong, but had been too afraid to look closely. He thanked me for doing what he couldn't. A corporate investigator asked if I would be willing to consult on cases involving whistleblower retaliation. I said yes. That conference changed something in me. It transformed the trauma of my experience into a kind of purpose. I started speaking more frequently at universities and industry events and corporate training sessions. I wrote articles about ethical leadership and the psychology of fraud. I mentored young professionals who reminded me of my younger self, hungry for success and vulnerable to manipulation. I became, improbably, a voice for integrity in an industry that had once nearly destroyed me. Elena and I collaborated on a book about our experiences, published by a major business press, and assigned reading in several graduate ethics courses. The writing process was difficult, forcing us to relive painful memories and confront questions we had avoided for years, but the finished product was something we were both proud of, a comprehensive account of how fraud happens, how it gets exposed, and how survivors rebuild their lives. The dedication page read, "For everyone who trusted the wrong person and found the courage to fight back." 10 years after Rick's conviction, I attended a reunion of former Callahan and Associates employees, organized by some of the administrative staff who had stayed in touch over the years. It was a small gathering, maybe 30 people, held at a restaurant in Lincoln Park. Some faces I recognized immediately. Others took a moment, changed by time and circumstance. We shared memories, some fond and some bitter, acknowledging the complicated reality that the company we had worked for had been both a formative experience and a criminal enterprise. At one point during the evening, a former analyst named David approached me hesitantly. He had been one of Rick's favorites back in the day, a rising star who had been groomed for executive leadership before the scandal derailed everything. After the collapse, David had struggled to find work, his resume permanently tainted by association. He told me he had spent years angry at me, blaming me for destroying the company and his career. He told me he had written a long letter once, full of accusations and rage, but never sent it. But now, he said, he understood. He had gone back and read all the court documents, all the investigative reports, all the evidence of what Rick had actually done. He saw the shell companies and the stolen funds. He saw the forged documents that had been prepared to frame me. He saw the systematic destruction of anyone who threatened to expose the truth. And he realized that Rick had been using all of them, every single employee, as cover for his crimes. David apologized for his anger. He thanked me for having the courage to do what he couldn't. I accepted his apology. I told him there were no hard feelings. And I meant it, because I understood better than most how easy it is to believe in someone who seems to offer you everything you want. I had believed in Rick for 16 years. David had simply never gotten the chance to see behind the mask. The reunion lasted late into the night. As I drove home through the quiet streets of Chicago, I thought about all the roads that had led me to this moment, the mailroom where it started, the corner office where it ended, the cold conference room where I had read my termination letter and sworn to find the truth, the federal courtroom where I had watched the handcuffs close around Rick's wrists, the stages where I had told my story to strangers who needed to hear it, the home where my family waited, patient and loving, ready to embrace me regardless of how the world defined my success or failure. Richard Callahan had been my boss, my mentor, my enemy. He had given me opportunities I never could have found on my own, and he had tried to destroy me when I became inconvenient. He had shown me both the best and the worst of what ambition can become. And in doing so, he had taught me the most important lesson of my career, that the people who claim to care about you the most are sometimes the people most willing to hurt you. Not because they're evil, not because they planned it from the beginning, but because in the end, some people will always choose their own survival over everything else. I don't hate Rick anymore. Hatred requires energy I no longer want to give him. What I feel instead is something closer to pity. He spent his entire life building a kingdom on lies, and when it finally collapsed, he had nothing left. No real friends, no family willing to stand by him, no legacy except cautionary tales and case study citations. He sacrificed everything good in himself for money he couldn't spend and power he couldn't keep. And now he's just another aging prisoner, counting the years until he dies in a federal facility far from the glittering world he once commanded. As for me, I have Angela, who has been my partner through everything and continues to make me grateful every day. I have Maya, now a teenager with her mother's wit and her father's stubborn determination, talking about law school and public interest work. I have work that matters, clients who trust me, colleagues who have become genuine friends. I have my integrity, tested and proven, something no one can ever take away. And I have this story, the story of how my ex-boss turned into my enemy, the story of betrayal and revenge, of trust destroyed and truth revealed, the story of the worst thing that ever happened to me and how I survived it. Some people hear my story and call me a hero. I'm not comfortable with that label. Heroes are supposed to do brave things without doubt or hesitation. I doubted constantly. I hesitated repeatedly. There were moments when I almost gave up, when the fear and uncertainty were so overwhelming that surrender seemed like the only option. What kept me going wasn't courage. It was anger at first. Then it was love. For my family and for the future, I refused to let Rick steal. And finally, it was something quieter. A simple conviction that the truth matters, that lies cannot stand forever, that eventually, always, the light finds its way through the darkness. Richard Callahan taught me many things during our 16 years together. He taught me how to read a financial statement, how to negotiate with difficult clients, how to present confidently in front of powerful audiences. He taught me that success requires sacrifice and that some opportunities only come once. But the most important thing he taught me was unintentional. He taught me that character matters more than charisma, that integrity outweighs intelligence, and that the people who seem most trustworthy are sometimes the ones you should trust least. I carry those lessons with me every day. I teach them to my daughter. I share them with the young professionals I mentor. And I remember always the kid from Inglewood who walked into a mailroom with nothing but ambition and walked out years later with wisdom that cost more than any education could provide. My name is Marcus Thompson. I was betrayed by the man I trusted most in the world, and I survived to tell the story. That's my revenge. Not the prison sentence, though that was satisfying. Not the destroyed reputation, though that was deserved. Not even the public exposure of all his crimes, though that was necessary. My real revenge is this: I'm still here. I'm still standing. I'm still building a life that means something. And Richard Callahan, wherever he is, whatever he's become, will spend the rest of his days knowing that the man he tried to destroy went on to thrive in spite of everything he did. Some nights, when the house is quiet and Angela is sleeping and Maya's room is dark, I sit on the back porch and look at the stars. I think about the long path that brought me to this place. I think about the mistakes I made and the lessons I learned. I think about all the people who helped me along the way and all the people I've tried to help in return. And I feel something I never expected to feel when I was sitting in that cold conference room, staring at a termination letter full of lies. I feel grateful, grateful for the struggle because it showed me what I was capable of, grateful for the betrayal because it taught me who I could trust, grateful for the revenge because it proved that truth can prevail even against overwhelming power, and grateful most of all for the life I have now, a life built not on someone else's favor or patronage, but on my own choices, my own values, my own refusal to be defeated. The story of my ex-boss turning into my enemy could have ended differently. It could have ended with me in prison, disgraced and destroyed, while Rick continued to prosper. It could have ended with me giving up, walking away, letting the lies stand unchallenged. It could have ended with bitterness and rage consuming everything good in my life. But it didn't. It ended here, with me at peace, surrounded by people I love, doing work that matters. It ended with the truth finally told and the consequences finally delivered. It ended not with vengeance, but with something better, with justice and healing, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that I never compromised who I was, no matter how hard I was pushed. That's the end of my story. But in another sense, it's also the beginning, because every day is a chance to apply what I've learned, to make choices that honor the struggle I survived, to be the kind of person that younger version of myself would be proud of. The boy from Englewood, who sorted mail in a cramped basement, the young man who worked his way through night school, the professional who climbed the corporate ladder only to discover it was leaning against a wall of lies. All of those people are part of me, and I carry them forward into whatever comes next. My ex-boss turned into my enemy, and in the process he accidentally showed me who I really was. For that, in the strangest way imaginable, I'm almost thankful. Almost.